And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian-Chu. Dr. Chu is a professor and Chancellor Scholar in the Department of Clinical Psychology in the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. He's also the Interim Director of Clinical Training and past Department Chair of Clinical Psychology. He founded and directs the Youth Anxiety and Depression Clinic, which has provided evidence-based family services and consultation to organizations since 2004. He's received grant funding from several sources, including NIMH and the William T. Grant Foundation and other state and local agencies, all focused on developing and evaluating mental health interventions and on training the next generation of mental health providers. He's co-authored and co-edited important books such as CBT treatment plans and interventions for depression and anxiety disorders in youth, and also trans-diagnostic treatments for children and adolescents, principles and practice. He's a fellow of the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies and past editor of the journal Cognitive Behavioral and Practice. And we're so grateful that he was willing to give his time today to teach us about anxiety treatment. So thank you.
Great. Josh, thank you so much for that warm introduction and for giving me this opportunity to speak and meet with this group of people. I think it's such an important time in the world where people are dealing with anxiety. And I also want to, lest I forget, to thank Chancellor Fran Conway, who also is sponsoring the series, and recognizing the importance of this topic in which anxiety and stress is something that we all face. I've slightly retitled the talk to reflect that, meeting the moment, thinking about evidence-based skills and strategies that we can use to address the anxiety in this challenging world. And what I hope to spend this time doing with this group is to set a little bit of the context for what youth and family are dealing with and managing in today's world, come up with some sort of way to conceptualize that in a way that can generate some kind of coping approach and some kind of in an action-oriented type of a way, and to do a deep dive into one particular skill that we use in the behavioral therapies, which is exposure therapy. And I agreed to do that after Josh suggested, wouldn't it be nice to focus on one particular skill like exposure to help kind of really showcase its strengths? And I thought that was a great idea and I agreed, and then immediately regretted that, knowing how challenging that can be in this relatively short time to really give an idea of what something like exposure can consist of, and then also to make that palatable to people. Because what we know about exposure, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, is that exposure therapies are amongst our most robust, if not the most robust intervention package that we have for addressing anxiety in the world. And yet it's also known to be one of the least used approaches out there because of the challenges that people often associate with it. And so we'll talk about some of those challenges. And my goal here is to hopefully demystify that. And I understand and have seen that this audience has been appealing to both practitioners and also to family members. And I think this is a perfect audience to try to do this with in terms of trying to help give some sort of introduction to it, to demystify this for therapists who might be employing this, but also for family members who might be introduced to this and think, oh, this is something that could be useful. Let's try it out. I do want to make sure that I identify that many of the worksheets and images and figures that I'm going to be using today are coming from this book that my good friend and colleague Sandy Pimentel and I just published recently, and want to disclose that I do receive royalties from that. In order to kind of get us in the room, I want to have engage you in an exercise where you just take a moment and reflect back on what the last time you felt anxious, stressed, or nervous. What was it about? When was it? Take just a second to do that. If you're like most people out there, it probably didn't take you very long to identify that. And if you were thinking about the last time, it probably didn't happen too far away. For me, it was just 3 slides ago. For you, I can imagine that it could have been something that was just happened right prior to this joining this meeting and some sort of other work activity. Maybe it's something like a text or a phone call that you got regarding family members or friends or kids. Maybe it's something that's on your to-do list that you keep thinking about. There's a constant slew of things that are keeping our mind occupied that might cause stress or anxiety. And if that did occur to you, you wouldn't be alone. We do know that upwards of 30% or more of individuals from youth to adults could be diagnosed with a clinical level of anxiety in America alone. And that can include a whole array of different formal disorders. That includes things like panic disorders, social anxiety, generalized worries, specific fears and phobias. And this doesn't even include a number of the childhood problems that are associated with anxiety, like selective mutism, and other problems like that. Also includes things like post-traumatic stress disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder, which aren't technically classified in anxiety disorders anymore, but often come in and are approached with the same kind of treatment applications. And unfortunately, things aren't getting much better for our kids with the amount of demands and lack of resources that they have available to children and families. They're experiencing unprecedented levels of stress related to school performance, peers, social relations, family, the world and world events, and others. And so there's a big challenge ahead of us in terms of those of us willing and interested in helping them. Here's my second exercise where it really would help me kind of center around who's in the room and what concerns that you deal with. I created a little survey here that I would love for you to participate in. You see the QR code there, and I think that if you're on your computer, you might have to use your phone. If you're on your phone, I honestly don't know how you'll do this separately, but we'll take who is available for those who can. But for me, what I would do is take my picture of the QR code with my phone, and when you get there, you'll see a survey that lists a number of options of challenges that you face, either as a therapist of the kids who come into your office and or as a parent that you're experiencing yourself. And you'll see a list of those, and you can just click on them. There's a little button there. You click on them to nominate them up into the top area, and then you can even grab them and rank order them so that you rank order them in the level of challenge or the frequency that you see them that seem to really stand out to you. So I'll give you some moments to do that. This is also the QR code here. This should kind of give us live results. And while you're doing that, I use this as my sneaky way of continuing to give some background while people are participating in this. So as I mentioned, even before COVID, which seems so long ago, 30% of kids between the ages of 13 and 18 were meeting criteria for anxiety disorders, formal anxiety disorders. Estimates suggest that during the most acute periods of COVID, that number of anxiety and mood disorders doubled. And unfortunately, that did not impact people equally across the board. We do know that globally that the effects of COVID, affected females and younger people and individuals of lower socioeconomic status even greater. And within the US, younger people and individuals of ethno-racial minorities experience the brunt of the mental health outcomes. And at the same time, right before, preceding, and during COVID, there are a number of social justice issues that really came to the forefront where we, as a country and culture, had to reckon with the outstanding inequities across groups. And so we saw people of ethno-racial minorities experiencing increased and prolonged discrimination and increased violence, faith-based crimes, and those discriminatory practices against gender and sex minorities as well, all leading to a high degree of people feeling vulnerable in their own homes, schools, and communities. And if one didn't count themselves in one of those underrepresented communities, there were concerns or increasing awareness of even more global issues like climate change, that were impacting all sorts of kind of outcomes across the board, and that youth were becoming increasingly aware of that, where global reports suggest that 40% of youth report at least moderate concern about the future impact of global warming. And so our kids are dealing with a lot. They're dealing with a lot out there. The encouraging news is that exposure to any of these negative events does not equate to harm itself. And in fact, we've learned a lot from the younger generations that youth activism and social engagement can help buffer from some of the effects of social injustice. And so the challenge for any therapist or healthcare worker, and particularly for cognitive behavioral therapists, is to help young people navigate a complex world where anxiety is an understandable reaction to all the stressors and barriers that they face, while also promoting action and self-efficacy. And that's what I hope, and that's what kind of excited me about the potential of talking about exposure today, because that is one of our most action-oriented interventions that people might be skeptical about. I'm seeing here in the survey, thank you for those who are able to fill this out, but I see that parent and family issues tend to be up. And again, kids are locked into their local home environment. So that could be the parent's own distress, their ability to manage the demands on them, family conflict, parent management. I would imagine that economic resources also impacts family, racism and social justice issues, feeling targeted or discriminated against, financial strain, economics. These are all the big question issues that I'm sure many people come to webinars like this saying, well, what can we do about these things? I'm working with kids and families, and they're dealing with big problems. And that doesn't even acknowledge some of these ordinary things like school pressures, just garden variety, clinical complexity, and that age-old favorite, gaming devices and social media, right? So what can we do about that? Well, the fortunate thing is that the field has identified and developed a number of strategies and interventions that have been found to be useful for the whole array of problems that come associated with anxiety. So when kids come with an identified problem with anxiety, they might cite actual functioning issues like those listed here in the left-hand column, physical tension or medical conditions, incessant worry and rumination that leads to reassurance seeking, repetitive negative self-statements, fear or distress-based avoidance, escape, and withdrawal, family environment conflict, et cetera, et cetera. And we have developed a number of strategies that can help in these circumstances, like with physical tension, as an example. And these aren't complete. This isn't a comprehensive list, but some of the most notable: relaxation, mindfulness, problem solving, cognitive restructuring. For social skills, we can do skill building, activity scheduling, exposures, cognitive restructuring. For depressive mood and anhedonia, we can use behavioral activation, values assessment, positive affect treatment. And so thinking of this list and being aware of this list, it gives me both hope in that our field has a number of tools associated with it, and it also can be overwhelming. And in fact, thinking about this webinar at first, when I thought, well, gosh, the topic is anxiety, we could talk about anything. And I'll be honest, I've done variations of this workshops hundreds of times, and I revised this one probably about a good dozen or so times, just trying to get down to a focus element, because there could be so many different directions we can go that could potentially be useful for families and therapists helping families. And I ended up deciding to go with Josh's original suggestion to focus on exposures as a way to try to demystify this very robust and powerful tool that's generally used to address fear or distress-based avoidance, escape, or withdrawal. But the way that we employ it, we're finding that it can be very useful in a number of different kinds of presenting problems and emotional presentations. And so I want to highlight some of those for you today. But let's ground ourselves in anxiety, since that's where we're starting. And I want to just give a quick get a review about what anxiety looks like in its most basic form. And we don't have to get too fancy, other than to kind of acknowledge that the way that most of us experience anxiety is that there's some kind of ambiguous a stimulus, like this friendly spider, but we interpret that ambiguous stimulus in a way that evokes some kind of intense emotion like fear or anxiety. And the behavioral reaction that follows is escape, right? That because that fear is so great, we escape and run away from the scenario. Once we've learned to associate those different situations with that fear experience, we then can anticipate that and start to avoid in advance of even approaching situations. And so avoidance and escape are two ends or two sides of the coin, just distinguished by temporality. And and if that ends up taking hold, it can be a very insipid process to unlearn at some point, right? So this is how avoidance gets it gets stuck in our system, in that when we get exposed to a scary stimulus like this spider, it is reasonable and expected that we would react to that with some level of fear, right? So here, if we were to look at this kind of graph in terms of a function of time and fear, when we see a spider, our initial reaction of fear will spike. And the problem that happens is that if our natural instinct is to escape, to run away, we would have more often than not a resulting decrease in that fear, right? And you've experienced this, and it doesn't have to be a spider. It can be anything that you're nervous about. You see something, whether it's a roach, a spider, vomit. You approach something like a plane, and you say, "I'm not going on that plane today." After you've made that decision to leave the situation, your anxiety decreases, and you've successfully, quote unquote, navigated that situation, right? And so this is the problem that we learn, is that people learn the very logical lesson, which is that if you are confronted with something very scary, if you leave that situation, it can work, right? It can have an immediate effect, and it's very logical to do so. The problem is that it only teaches you one set of lessons, which is that escape leads to quick and effective way to feeling less scared, and it theoretically avoids experiencing any immediate harm, or at least speculated harm. What you miss out on are the lessons that oftentimes, if you had just stuck in it, if you had stayed in that same room with the spider, likely your fear would have abated over time anyway. And you would have kind of, quote unquote, realized that it wasn't as bad to start with. You would also probably learn some other skills to cope with that fear as you stayed in that situation that you could use for that situation and future situations like that. And so this is a model reminding us that the reason why people avoid and escape in the first place is not some sort of irrational or illogical process, but it's one that people are using in a quick cost-benefit analysis to escape things that bother them. Now, this is the kind of habituation curve that we use to educate people on fear and anxiety for a long time. And what we have learned since then, or we always knew, but we kind of didn't really emphasize, is that fear doesn't always abate over time, right? So, and maybe sometimes with some specific fears, we can count on the fact that you would naturally habituate over time with that. But there are a lot of situations and problems like the ones that we listed above before, like family issues, like social issues, school and performance, that don't abate because they're chronic stressors and they keep repeating themselves. And for those that aren't repeating themselves, we also tend to kind of maintain them in our mind by thinking about them over and over. And so here in this situation where a kid might be feeling like that they're not fitting in at school and feeling misplaced, that stressor can feel like it's enduring over time. And so what can we do in those places, and how can we use action-oriented therapies to motivate people to pursue things that might be difficult? And here, what we have to teach is a different set of skills, not just that, we anticipate that if you use a particular set of coping skills, you're going to feel better, but rather that we can learn a set of coping skills that it can help you manage and bear through that distress or anxiety. And that we can also learn a set of skills to challenge expectations of what bad things might happen. Because even if you feel stressed through that situation, maybe you might learn that if you go to that party or get together, maybe you'll learn that those kids aren't as exclusive as you thought that they were. Maybe you'll have more fun than you thought you would. Maybe you would meet one kid that you would actually could hang out and be friends with. And nonetheless, it might take some effort in order to learn those positive lessons. And we have to also reconsider what would it take to have us push through and bear through this distress in order to learn those lessons. And that's where we have to focus on high value goals that help highlight what the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow might look like, right? Because in this situation, people can learn to bear through distress and difficulties if they're doing so for other valuable reasons or valued reasons, right? In this case, that wanting to socialize or meet one or two people that you feel understood by, that you share experiences with, that you share interests with, that you could potentially build a quality friendship, that might be worthwhile, even if you have to go to a couple of awkward parties where you don't feel quite in place, right? And so this, if you want to relate to your own experience, think about times, and there might be some that just happened today, right before this meeting, of things where you were like, I don't really want to do that. And yet you might have pushed through. Maybe that email that you sent off that you've been avoiding for a long time. And I'm not talking about the emails that you're doing right now, because those are the easy ones, right? You're like, oh, I can shoot off these emails and listening to this webinar at the same time. But what about those emails that you're pushing off or avoiding? What would lead you to, when we get off this webinar, to prioritize that email to send off? And is to focus on what the potential positive benefits are that would encourage you to do that, whether it's because you know that you'll feel relief after you've sent that, whether it's because you know that it will help you move along to the next stage of that project that's important to you. And that's what the kind of experience that we want to emphasize here as well. Now, I'm going to take a slight detour back because what's important is that anytime that we talk about intervention, we have to start with a good conceptualization. It's important for us to remember that interventions are not something we do to clients. And for families out there, you shouldn't feel like a therapist is suggesting something that you aren't aware of the purposes for and that you're not bought into. And so instead, it helps by starting with a collaborative conceptualization. This is our most simple form of that, which is a CBT model developed by Aaron Beck early on, which just suggests that any particular emotional experience could be explained through some reciprocal relations between the thoughts that we have, our emotional experiences, and the actions and behaviors, right? And we can get, and it can help explain how you're processing a particular kind of emotional experience, here separation anxiety, by looking at what that person's or that child's reaction to are in terms of their thoughts. My parents will get into an accident, a robber will break in and steal me, and what kind of impact that has on their physiological reactions, like these intense panic-like symptoms or complaints about stomachache, sickness, or nausea. And then how does that contribute to their avoidant and escape related behaviors, clinging to the parents, reassurance seeking, attention seeking, protest arguments, et cetera, et cetera. And when we collaborate on a conceptualization like this, we are creating a psychoeducation and buy-in that can lead to a facilitated intervention like exposure later on. And that's why I do this in a collaborative way with families to create their own conceptualization that we are working with together, right? But it's important, and this is the heart of being a good behaviorist, which is getting as specific as possible. And so I'm going to introduce you to our friend Nicole, who's a composite case of a number of different cases that Sandy and I have worked on over the years. And this particular case is highlighted not in the book, but in a recent book chapter that we just wrote for a wonderful text by Bob Freeberg. But we're going to highlight how we create a conceptualization for this client, this teen, and then talk about developing exposures for her to meet her complex needs. This is a 14-year-old Asian American cisgender female coming with a clinical profile of generalized anxiety disorder, depressive disorder symptoms. And what's important is that we always center even more than on our diagnostic profile, but the top problems or the concrete functional outcomes that they are complaining about. What is concerning to them, either the youth themselves or the family? And here, the combination of them were concerned because this was a girl who was previously really engaged and interested in both her interests, activities, social relations in school, and she started to withdraw from friends and her activities, her hobbies, and she became distracted in classrooms, failing to turn in homework. And so it marked a change in her functioning, even though the parents would acknowledge that she had always been seen as kind of a sensitive child. She worried about people, animals, and world events. But as um, she grew older, she became more aware and discouraged about historical events like civil rights and wars that had occurred or that are occurring, and global events like climate change and poverty, and discouraged by what she saw as inactivity from the adults around her trying to help solve the problem. And what this led to was, substantial preoccupation of her thoughts, disrupted sleep, muscle tension, depressed mood, withdrawal, and so those are the elements that we're going to try to help Nicole with. But it's important that we are always also looking at her strengths and interests to find that pot of gold at the end of any intervention, which is that if we were to help her manage these symptoms and struggles more, what could she be? What would be the motivator, and what could we replace those with, right? And it starts with a good understanding of what is going on for Nicole. It's important to understand how to help kids and families pay attention to how they act and why they act, that can then lead to a powerful and intervention like an exposure with buy-in. And this is a demonstration of one simple tool we call functional assessment. You could also call it behavioral assessment or a chain analysis, of where we're looking to understand how Nicole responds in certain situations and why that might be maintained, why she would be acting in a way or reacting in a way that leads to undesired outcomes, right? And so this is a typical ABC sequence. And we start by asking her to start to monitor, or to the degree that she might have insight. And we involve the parents as well to help monitor this and think about different situations. How is she responding in terms of emotions and thoughts to that? And then what kind of actions does she take in response to those emotions and thoughts? So, for example, she's watching news about the LA forest fires over the summer, and she feels worried and scared. Now, she says, "Can this happen to us?" This here is a combination of thoughts and feelings. You could separate these out as if you want to. You can expand this table. To me in this moment, it's more important about what's her initial reaction emotionally, and then what is her behavioral response to that. That when she is worried about the LA forest fires, her response is to look up more news and images on her phone. That's her instinct to do. When she's volunteering at the animal shelter, she feels sad and scared. Will all these animals find a home? And her reaction is to freeze up. She gets lost in thoughts about what will happen to them, right? When she watches a kid at school being mean to another kid, she gets sad. I wish someone would stop that. But she looks away, and she looks away and then walks away. And it's important to spend some time just simply describing. We don't even have to explain yet, but just describe, how does Nicole react into these situations in which she and her family are saying get her into trouble, that these lead to prolonged kind of like hours in her room where she crashes on her bed and then doesn't resurface because she's feeling distressed. And so we have her fill out these, and then the next thing that we'll ask is to fill out, sorry, we focus on that, is to fill out this this last column actually, which is, so what happens when you do that? What happens when you're watching the news about the LA forest fires? You end up spending another 20, 30 minutes or more of looking at more news images. What do you recall happening? And they'll say, kids will open, like, be full disclosure. Well, I actually get more stress. I can't stop thinking about it. I don't want to do this. The parents will acknowledge, agree. Yes, she spends the rest of her night looking at more images. When she's volunteering at the animal shelter, she freezes up, and what does she do? Well, then I leave. I kind of like I panic and I get out of there, and I can't stay there any longer, right? And so we get them to identify what are the outcomes, and to be fair about their assessment and say, is this what you hope for? Is this what the way that you would like to react in those situations? And by the way, if they say, yes, I don't care, I like to spend my whole entire time, it's functional for me, I get a lot out of reading more information about forest fires and climate change. And in fact, I take that and then I write in my own blog and I use that as information. If that's the case and it works for this kid, we go no further. That's a workable outcome. But he or she is saying that I get more stressed and I can't stop thinking about it. I spend too much long time online. And when we hear that, then it begs the next question of then, hey, do you have a sense about why you do that? Because if anyone else were reading this line and saying, okay, in the situation where you see some news about forest fires and you're feeling worried, and you then spend the next couple hours looking up, more images, what, and that leads to getting more distressed, wouldn't you think that that would kind of punish the reaction? Wouldn't you think that that would naturally convince you to stop? Boy, this is really miserable. I hate doing this. It would make you think to stop. And that's when we have to look closely at what happens in the immediate short term. What's going on that might actually extend this chain from to continue? And this is where we find the real insight from a behaviorist perspective, is looking for the relief and reinforcement, whether that's positive or negative, that's keeping it going. So here in this case, that yes, I end up looking at more news, but I'm doing it because I'm trying to reassure myself, finding news that would help me realize that we could be safe. When I leave the shelter without telling anyone, it's something I can't help because it makes me so anxious, and so it stops me from feeling anxious. When I don't get help for that kid who's getting picked on, what it does is it lets me kind of avoid it, and I don't have to um, um, acknowledge that it's happening. And so this is really the crux of any good behavioral conceptualization that will lead into some exposure program that says, like, okay, we understand that the cue that leads to an emotional reaction. We understand the long-term reaction, which is in this case, which is uh, escape. But that escape comes with some negative things, and what we have to understand is what's maintaining that escape, and how could we supplement that or support that instead of running away. Okay. We package that into this nice little form to help us take the individual behavioral chain back into our CBT triangle to help explain, for Nicole, this is how she reacts to these kind of situations. It leads to these short and long-term functions. And we want to then, of course, also marry that with what her explicit goals and values are. I populate this in advance just to kind of move us along, but it's always critical for us when we're understanding where to go with a family, is to understand that they come with their own strengths and supports, and we want to be aware of what those are. And there's also individual, local, and systemic barriers that we want to be aware of. How supportive is her friend group or her parents and family in this environment? Are there other systemic discriminations that will kind of work against her, and we have to be aware of? So we're not naive to helping her take proactive stances. All right, so that kind of leads us to then, how do we convert that into exposures? I will stop for a brief moment just to see if there are questions here. Great. Oh, anyway, this was just part about the poll. Great. Glad that people figure that out. And I'll keep moving then. So let's talk about how we convert this into exposures based on conceptualization. A little background on exposure experiential exercises to have clients approach things that are distressing, scary, or avoided. The purpose of moving towards approach is both to extinguish non-constructive reinforcers, so to break a little bit of the chain between feeling fear towards that spider, letting it kind of habituate on its own. But even more than that is to foster new conditioned associations. So learning that in the presence of a spider, I also get to go to a picnic. I get to hang out with friends. I get to be outside. And to challenge non-constructive learned expectations. Like, even if there's a spider, they won't come towards me. They're more scared of me than I am of them. And then getting into contact with new salient reinforcers, like going and being able to play outside with my friends. There are several different kinds of exposures. The gold standard that we try to get to in most cases is called in vivo exposures. These are real in-life exposures where we actually take clients to the places where they are experiencing distress. So instead of just talking about a spider, we would actually bring a spider to session and or its similar kind of stimuli and or go out to a field where there might be spiders around. And these can be kind of exposures to people, places, things, or activities that arouse anxiety or distress. In situations where we can't necessarily replicate or bring the client to, we can use imaginal exposures. These are using someone's imagery, their imagination to try to envision the scenario. This is very useful in situations that cannot be easily recreated, like flying a plane or other traumatic events. It's often used for trauma as a way to help reapproach the scenarios that have us continually upset and distressed, even when the situations are no longer present. And we also have interoceptive exposures where we expose people to their own internal bodily cues. And so if someone is sensitive to panic attacks and their interpretations of those is that if I have a heart, an unusual heart rhythm or accelerated heart, or if I'm feeling sweaty, or if I am feeling short of breath, that means I'm going to die or that I'm sick. We actually can create those by doing a number of exercises like running up and down the stairs, spinning around in a circle, spinning on a chair. And those help recreate those feelings so that you can literally be exposed to your own bodily cues and get accustomed to them so that you can learn new lessons, which is that I can have those and they don't mean that I'm going to die. Our first step to creating good exposures by creating what we call hierarchy. And these are incremental steps of challenges that would help us approach things that are currently scary for us. So here are some examples reflecting different kinds of worries and fears. The first one over here on the upper left is approaching socio-academic contexts. And these are, kind of in reverse. The more distressing it goes, more distressing as it goes down. So easier to harder. And we do order them. And I'll come back to that in a second. But what you try to do is really think about incremental steps along the way to the end result that you're hoping for would be ideal. So if this particular person or kid is hoping that I want to be able to present a research project to my parents and brothers or in the classroom, that's where you want to get to. And everything before that are incremental steps that help them be able to learn new lessons that, yes, I can do that even though it's distressing. And there's other positive things that come along with that, right? And so it can start with just walking up to the teacher after class and asking a question, sitting up and making eye contact with the teacher in English class, giving an impromptu talk, but only to safe people, right? Here, when we're talking about concerns of fear of separation, for example, at school, but it could also be in extracurricular activities. It can be at bedtime. The end goal might be to talk to the teacher at the bus stop or to be able to enter class. You would then use incremental steps like standing second or third in line at the dismissal, having the mother progressively move out of of this kid's sight, being able to take the school bus to school on their own, all the way up to talking to the teacher and eventually moving into the building. Even from these, what you can tell is that these are a combination of exercises that we tend to plan that can occur both in the therapy room, but also on site. And that's where some of the challenges of exposures happen, which is how do we manage all these different scenarios? And it takes a bit of planning, it takes a bit of access and willingness. And so those are some of the challenges. But what I would do is I would recommend at this stage is that, brainstorm your fantasy challenges so that you don't hold yourself back at this situation, at this stage. The same thing for kids that are worried about illness or safety. It can start off relatively simple with checking the weather forecast, holding off from answering questions and reassuring questions from their their parents or other caregivers, all the way up to coming into more and more contact with fearful stimuli, like going to a beach and stand and play in the surf for 20 minutes where might be you might be vulnerable to the elements. This is a blend of safety issues and also illnesses, talking about contracting measles or carrying a laminated photo of what the measles might look like. This was a close model after one of Sandy's cases where he did have some sort of real worry about the zombie apocalypse coming. I also want to highlight that, as I mentioned, exposures can take on different looks and not just focus on discrete fears. We've been employing it more and more with things that have to do with depression. And in depression, it's a similar outcome in which anytime there's the onset of a aversive situation, like doing homework, doing a work assignment, going to meet up with friends when you're not in the mood for it, there will be a spike of effort. There'll be a spike that's required. There'll be a spike of anhedonic feelings if I don't want to do this. And we can use exposures in the same way to give practice at initiating activity and helping the client start to understand what is it that gets me stuck as I'm feeling this buildup of discomfort and I don't want to do it and I'd rather quit. And so we can orient it towards activities that the child wants to participate in and helping monitor where they get stuck along the way. And so this one is particularly focusing on pushing through activities with sustained effort. So if we return to Nicole and thinking about her presenting problem, where she's mostly concerned about the events of the world, and how she, can help feel confident and efficacious. She's also had some problems with friends in which they don't understand and share the same values that she shares. And so she has gotten into some conflicts with friends who made her feel badly about being vegetarian. That's not reflected in this one particular chain, but it is part of what led to our brainstorming a set of exposures challenges for her related to how she could approach that friend and or other friends and talk out her feelings. And this is, a kind of rethinking about exposures as not just an exposure to something that makes you scared, but rather moving towards situations, people, activities that would bring about valued outcomes for her. And so what's in it for her? The pot of gold at the end of that rainbow would be the fact that A, she could get some greater understanding with her friend. Potentially B, she would develop a stronger connection with that friend. And C, even if those concrete outcomes don't occur, she would gain a greater sense of self-efficacy in how she can express herself. So should she be developing new friendships, she would know how to approach them in future occurrences. And so we created exposures here where, she would start with very, where it's simpler for her, reading an article on why humane treatment of animals is good, writing down my thoughts about why I volunteer at the animal shelter, up through, talking with a safe person directly about it, about why it's okay for me to be a vegetarian or why it's okay for one person to be a vegetarian and another person not to be, getting more public by posting pro-vegetarian posts on social media, talking to texting the friend to talk, and then all the way up to having a conversation with the friend, not only just to have a conversation generically about vegetarianism, but also to describe why it hurt when her friend made fun of her choices. And once you've developed this hierarchy, you continue to develop an understanding of what is most concerning for the child. You're creating buy-in because they're generating ideas for things that they would want to see themselves do. And if that's, where the challenge is, if they can't come up with anything that they themselves would respect and or value, then you have to spend time here because we don't want to be doing exposures with someone who's not bought into it. And when it comes time to finally implementing one of these exposures, we use a variety of different processes to help prepare the child for that. This is a worksheet that we have in the book. There are others and formats you can do it informally. This one just happens to use kind of an integrated approach of where we are setting up the scenario, we are reviewing her concerns and fears about that, we are helping her develop a couple of coping tools leading up to going into the feared situation, and then setting up some achievable goals that she would like to see herself accomplish while she's in that situation so that she will feel good and have a concrete metric to evaluate herself after to say, yes, I completed that, so that she knows that she was successful, even if the outcomes that are out of her control, like how her friend reacts, even if they don't, happen in the way that she would ideally hope for. So in Nicole's example, she has agreed to finally to say that I'm going to talk to my friend that hurt my feelings when she made fun of vegetarians. We help her identify what her experience was like, that she felt hurt, and it's just distressing at a 7 out of 10 in terms of thinking about approaching her friend. We have her identify the different kinds of thoughts that she might be experiencing going into that. She's going to deny that she even did that, and we'll get into a big fight. And she'll make even more fun of it and make me feel even worse. We help them identify, based off of skills that we've been teaching them along the way, of how to identify maybe we're making some assumptions here, and are there any kind of thinking traps that we're falling into? Like, are we potentially jumping to conclusions when we assume that your friend is going to deny that she never said that? Are we doing some catastrophizing when we believe that she's going to make more fun of it? And we generate some coping thoughts like, well, she didn't know how important it was to me. Maybe she was just saying, making some offhanded comment. And so maybe when I tell her, she'll understand. Or we don't have to agree on everything to be friends, as long as she understands and shows care. And really, when I go into this, what I'm most motivated by is I want to be able to tell her that I was hurt. And we focus here these achievable goals on things that she has control over. I would hesitate on listing goals where she doesn't, like, I want my friend to understand. We don't know that the friend's going to understand. We don't even know that they're going to reflect back any sort of kind of empathic statements, but rather I want to be able to say that I was hurt. I also want to feel like I finished my thoughts about vegetarianism. And then I'd like to try to reconnect about something that we both like. Afterwards, I think it'd be great if we both went to, but if not, if I was able to accomplish this, I'm going to make sure that I reward myself by going for acai bowls and maybe write some positive things in the journal myself afterwards. Okay. And so that's how we set this up. And as you can tell, this can encompass a broad array of different types of circumstances. This one, you would think, requires the friend to be available. And this is some of the challenges that we face with exposures. We can't always guarantee that the person that we need to be available is going to be available. And so we do have to be creative. We have to be flexible. It might be the case that we have to set up 2 or 3 of these ideas so that we can be ready that if one starts and ends very quickly, we could move on to a second one. Let's have, like, let's go back to posting another social media post about vegetarianism if your friend isn't available, right? We might have to take this and assign for homework. Homework's an important part of our work, but I don't want to rely exclusively on that. What I want to do is try to do it as live as possible, because we do know that the degree of implementation and follow through with homework falls off the shelf compared to even what we see in session, which is that we can continue to be there to help support the client. Our role is to support, to encourage, and to have them continue taking next steps even after they've met all these different checkpoints. And while doing that, continue to assess where are they getting into some stuck points, because the goal of our work here is to monitor and to support as Nicole is going through this prolonged distress arc, and helping to give the encouragement that she needs while she's climbing the steepest part of the hill, and to help identify when she might want to escape, when she distracts, when she wants to quit, and to help remind her that she's able to stay there. to help her practice coping skills like coping thoughts and or problem solving or relaxation exercises that help her maintain herself in this area, in the scenario, so that she can continue on um, and persist even through challenges and difficulty. And in so doing, that she could hopefully experience some positive outcomes afterwards. And when we talk about positive outcomes, they could be many. And it's not just, oh, my friend understood everything and she realizes she's wrong and she admitted that it was wrong, but rather there's some other take-home messages that we can learn that we can generalize. And those can include like, look, not everyone's going to be your best friend, or not everyone understands where you're coming from. But what's important is that I can express myself. Or, I could only talk to my friend during lunchtime and there were two other kids there. And those other two kids agree with me, even though my friend didn't, right? So you can, you know, benefit from what we call the pleasant surprise. And we help them understand that both by, helping them evaluate what happened and taking out some of those thinking traps to really take stock in terms of what happened. And of course, we want to praise any increment of completion so that they feel like it's more and more doable every time they do it. And that's one of our big part of the jobs, is just making sure that they know that we have observed them doing things that they've never done before. Now, there are lots of challenges, as I mentioned, in doing exposures, and those challenges can be things like client and therapist fear or buy-in. And that's where I spent a lot of my the talk here focusing on conceptualization, because if you start early and you're including them in an understanding and a model of what's going on for them, we hope that by the time that you've gotten moved down the track, that it's almost obvious that, oh, I guess the only thing to do is to try to do it, to try to do the next thing, to try to do it. Otherwise, I'm going to be stuck in this cycle. And so that's where the psychoeducation can come in, the conceptualization, some motivational interviewing. There's also some real challenges, like access to materials, access to relevant context and things like that. That's where it's helpful. A couple of things. Telehealth has really helped us. We continue to use it more and more, in which we're able to use phone coaching, FaceTime coaching, Zoom coaching, where we can be in the office and we can have them be in their homes, be in others, peer environments, other places where we can kind of do bug in the ear coaching and be there while they're approaching these challenging situations. There are some other concerns about things like liability and privacy that are more fears than real concerns. And what's important is that you do discuss this process with clients as you go through it, saying, hey, here's what we intend to do. I am not going to force you to do anything that you aren't willing to do. But the important thing is that we come to an understanding that this is useful for you in getting the things that you want out of life, and I'm here to support you. And so when you are ready to take that step, I'm going to be with you every step of the way. And so that's, your own taking ownership of that process. But it is important, if you're going out in the world, that you should talk ahead of time with them about confidentiality and privacy. You may run into people who recognize you or them, and you want to have a game plan, like, who are you to this person? And so if you run into someone else, are you, a teacher? Are you a coach? Are you a big buddy or something like that? What is it that that you can come up with, so that you don't interrupt the whole session, you don't get into some sort of like tangent, but that you do acknowledge their concerns. Much of this, I would say, could help if you do have the ability to work in teams. And so if you work in a clinical practice where you have multiple people doing exposures, that helps with having the right mentality, context, and others to help out. I do notice we only have a couple of minutes, and so I, didn't plan this exactly. I have additional case examples, which I knew that you would have access to slides, and so you can see the variety of different other types of exposures. I do want to leave a minute or two for questions, but essentially what I want to encourage people going forward is that taking steps towards coping and wellness present with a lot of options, and there are many paths to get there, but taking that first step is a way to help start to cope with things. And don't be afraid to continue to reference that conceptualization as you go forward and taking active coping steps. With that, I want to just thank you for your time. I know everyone is busy and has many things on their to-do list. And so if there's one or two questions, I'll be happy to answer those now. Which I'll open this up. I don't see any current questions, but if there are any, I'll pause for a moment. And yes, what you can do is that in terms of the worksheets, all of those, the worksheets and the conceptualization forms are embedded in the book that I disclosed at the beginning. I'm also happy that when this gets forwarded to people, I can send a sample of those out to people so that people can take a look and make use of those.
Brian, there's a question sent to me. I'll read it to you.
Okay.
You had said that when the client is doing an exposure and wants to escape, we remind them to use coping skills, mindfulness, etc. Can you talk more about this? Should clients use these skills to get through the moment, or is it better to have them sit with the discomfort and address it head on?
Yes, that's a great question and a deep dive into exposures. It's what it's reflecting is it's two approaches to exposures. One is the former habituation model, in which we're kind of thinking that the important aspect of the exposure is that they experience the increase in distress and that they feel the decline in that, and that is what equates to a successful experience. What we now know is that learning is enhanced two things. One, it's not the case that habituation occurs in all, and in fact, not most situations, but it does occur. So you could experience habituation. But two, what we have learned from behavioral science is that you don't need that, and you might not actually desire that. In fact, the ideal state for someone to be in one of these situations is to be in an activated state so that you experience it fully. And so one might say, if you were approaching very concrete fears, you might want to just stay there and not use other tools like coping statements in order to bring down the distress. However, I have another approach in which it's important that in these more goal-oriented or task-oriented exposures where they're trying to accomplish a task, like go and talk to a friend, what I want to stay focused on is they're achieving their behavioral goals. And so for me, it's less important for me to even monitor what they're doing with the distress, but more accomplishing those goals. And if they're using a coping tool like coping self-statements to help them stay in the moment so that they can achieve the goal that's important to them, I endorse that because that's what I'm focusing on, is the functional outcome at the end of that rainbow.